Hello and welcome to another of our University of Wolverhampton Christmas lecture shorts. Today I'm here with Dr. Stephen Gregg, who works at the university. Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Gregg. I'm currently the Head of Department of Social Sciences, Inclusion and Public Protection, but I've got a background in the study of religion, and I'm currently the President of the British Association for the Study of Religions.
Fabulous. Thank you, Stephen. So in the UK, we celebrate Christmas in a particular way, but how did we get there? What was it that underpins the way that we celebrate today?
Well, it's a long story, but I'll try and be brief.
Okay.
And it goes right back to early Christianity. Now, I want to dispel a myth, actually, just to start. There's a lot of literature that looks at Roman interaction with early Christianity, things like Saturnalia, Juvenalia. Actually, there's no evidence that suggests that that did influence early Christianity. And one of the reasons for that is because early Christians weren't interested in Christmas. It's the nativity stories of Jesus only appear in two of the Gospels. They're quite different stories. We're not told when Jesus was born. There's now argument over where Jesus was born, so that's fun, isn't it? You know, it's almost certainly Nazareth. It's almost certainly not Bethlehem, and so it's really in the 3rd century that we start to get this look at the 25th of December as a particularly important date. And in fact, it's not until the 4th century that it's really a celebrated feast. And there's a complicated backstory there about arguments over Jesus's humanity and Jesus's divinity. But in a nutshell, the church decided they needed to focus on the humanity of Jesus. So we better get a story together about how he was born and how he came into the world. But then, of course, in the early church, we get people like St. Nicholas. Now, he's a character that most people will have heard of, particularly with links to Father Christmas a bit later down the road. And we're pretty sure he existed. We think he was a bishop in Turkey, and we're told that he was a generous man, and he would often give money to families who were in need. And there's quite a famous story, a little bit depressing, about a father who wanted to look after his daughters but couldn't afford to, and they may well have needed to go into, let's just say, the oldest profession in the world. And so he gave the family money so that the daughters didn't have to do this. So that's why St. Nicholas is not just the patron saint of children, but also the patron saint of prostitutes. So what a wonderful start there for a Father Christmas myth. But what we get, of course, is the development of this through different cultures that have impacted on Britain, over the centuries. And really, that means we're looking at the traditional British approaches and the Germanic ones, which are, quite famous because of 19th century developments. So one of the things we get in the Middle Ages, of course, is the problem of winter. In Northern Europe, winter isn't a great time of year. It's very difficult to farm. It's very cold. It can also be a lonely place. It's dark, especially in sort of, Norway, Sweden. It's a really, problematical time of year to live in. And so we would have come together in winter festivals that would have lasted, a period of time. One of the things that we look at with modern Christmas is the 25th, and sometimes Advent with our calendars, but we really focus on the 25th. That's not what would have happened. We would have had a celebration for a sort of 10, 12-day event. We pick that up actually in the 12 days of Christmas, which of course goes after Christmas, from the 25th to the 6th of January. And many of our traditions will come from these British heritages. So things like mistletoe. Now, we know that mistletoe was important to the Druids. It was used in rites and ceremonies, and that's because it was seen as a plant of peace. It was a sign of peace. In fact, there's possibly a myth, possibly a story, about warring factions or warring tribes meeting each other in a forest, but seeing some mistletoe, so they had a truce. They had a treaty of peace and wouldn't fight again until the next day. And so we get this linking of mistletoe to happiness, and fertility. And that's why we still kiss under the mistletoe, because we're coming together. It's a peaceful, loving thing to do. And with the winter festival, with this sort of, 2-week long festival, it's often linked with, of course, the solstice on the 21st, before we settled in Britain on the 25th. And we can see that in our ancient landscape. When we look particularly at Stonehenge, Stonehenge is famous for aligning with the summer solstice, and you'll have thousands of people that go there. It's very nice of them to go there, but actually they're wrong, because Stonehenge is aligned with the winter solstice. That was the main ritual point of the year, and you'll only get a couple of hundred people gathered for that, but they're the ones who've understood it properly. So this time of year was always special, even before we focused just on the 25th. And people had fun. They would eat well. Even the poor might have, a small amount of livestock that would have been culled, because they would have chosen the livestock that wouldn't have made it through the winter. And there would have been quite raucous events. There was the Lord of Misrule, who would dress up and run around and trick people. And I think we still have that when it comes to the games that we play, and particularly pantomime, which I appreciate comes from an Italian heritage as well. But it's picking up that idea of fun, which has never really gone away in the British psyche. And another thing they'd have done at these long winter festivals is tell stories. Absolutely essential that we perpetuate the stories of our ancestors, that we keep going our stories about religion. And I think it's really interesting that King Arthur, one of our great mythic heroes, well, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, one of the most famous poems in medieval literature, it's based at Christmas. The Green Knight comes back each Christmas to challenge Gawain. And so we have these wonderful stories that are being perpetuated through the winter and the Christmas season. And then we need to look at the Nordic element, the Germanic element, and really that's the main thing that we've sort of bolted onto from modern Christmas. And there's lots of things that come through here. Probably the most famous being Father Christmas, perhaps. We talked about St. Nicholas earlier, but if we look at the All-Father, the King of the Gods, sometimes called Odin, sometimes called Woden, well, when we look at his mythology, he's an old man. It's just over my shoulder, actually. He's an old man. He wears a hat. He has a long beard, and he flies through the sky. He has an 8-legged horse called Sleipnir, who will actually take his carriage across the sky. And some of the myths, and we do need to be careful here, but some of the myths talk about him giving gifts to children in boots. This might be a later view being sort of cast back upon those myths, but it's fun that we've got this sort of lineage that talks to each other. Even elves. You look at Will Ferrell sitting on a shelf or running around a department store in Elf. This comes from Elva, the Germanic understanding of the little people who live in our landscape and will interact with people to give them, good luck, but sometimes also to play tricks on them. And talking about tricks, spirits. Spirits are really important at Christmas, and this comes largely from Germanic understandings of elves and ancestors, and that hasn't gone away. You can think of the ghost stories that we tell at Christmas, and the most famous, of course, is Dickens' Christmas Carol, but we have the M.R. James ghost stories, which the BBC's actually been doing in recent years. They've been beginning to show those again, often on Christmas Eve. So we get these remembrances, if you like, and some of them have changed a little bit. We'll have cakes in the shape of a Yule log. Well, that used to be a real log. That would be brought in, that would be lit, and more than a log, think of a small tree, it would probably burn for about 12 days as the heart of the gathering. That brings us to things like, bringing in the holly, bringing in the trees. Things like the fir tree were seen as giving life because it was evergreen and it grew in a barren landscape. And then we have things like the trees, and for many Christians, they would decorate it with apples, because that associated creation with Adam and Eve, and the giving of life by God. So we're perpetuating that. So we're getting this meshing between the pagan traditions and the Christian. So it's not that there was pagan and then there was Christian. It's this constant conversation between them. Another example, carol singing. That started as wassailing, wassel, as the old Saxon for good health. So we're going from door to door, and we're wishing people good health through our carols. So there's lots of these, I think we call them remembrances, where we pick up on these traditions that perhaps never really went away.
Wow, that is so interesting. And I didn't realise that we decorated trees with apples. And I presume that's where the baubles come from, the green
You're
and
exactly right.
red baubles.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. You're quite right. And things like the tinsel, represent the sort of, the plants that would have been put across.
Yeah.
It's a celebration of life in the darkness.
Yeah.
And obviously we had candles on them as well, and we now put the fairy lights on. But, I suppose we can't over-egg how difficult winter would have been.
Yeah.
So we need this celebration, and we look to light and we look to birth, and these become key themes really for both pagan and Christian celebrations in winter.
I was struck by the story of the two warring tribes that came together, saw the mistletoe, and chose to wait for another day before they went to battle. And that reminds me a little bit of that story that, there's a lot of did it happen, didn't it happen about World War One and the troops.
The football game.
The football game.
Yeah, that's tremendous fun, isn't it? It's that's sort of a remembrance from schoolboy days, that story. And it's I think I remember reading somewhere that I think perhaps it did happen. I think it's become mythic in its importance, but I think there might be a kernel of truth in it, if I remember rightly.
I think we were very lucky to have Professor Sheffield talk about this at one of our previous Christmas lectures, and he believes it happened, but not necessarily on Christmas Eve, and at the point at which we think it happened.
And we're good at doing that. You see, we take events and then we place them where we want to do. So we go back to the nativity. There's no way Jesus was born on the 25th of December. We're told there are lambs gambling around the fields, so that wasn't how it happened, but we're choosing to put it at this significant event, just like the football match.
So thank you so much for sharing that with us, and this is going to be a wonderful opening to our lecture series, and we are going to follow up with some other shorts that look at some of the traditions that people celebrate around the world, and you'll see the linkages between what Dr. Gregg has shared with us and what other people say about how they celebrate. So, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for launching this lecture series. We really appreciate your time and your expertise in this area.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks.